All right, so I am going to make a short little video that is going to talk about the Redux cycle. Redux is a global state management system for JavaScript. It can be used in many JavaScript languages, such as React, Angular, Vue, the focus of this video is going to be specific to React Redux. And this video is also going to assume that you have some basic knowledge of React itself. And so, with React, of course, you have various components. You have functional components, which are dumb components, and then you can have class components. And typically with class components, those are going to be the components that will have their own local state. And of course, typically with the React architecture, you'll see maybe the app component will have what you, I guess, would view as your main state, which will hold a lot of the information that you'll use across all of the app, and each of the other components will need, and it'll pass it through as props to each of the components. You may also see some other use cases of local state without Redux. Most popularly, probably you'll see it in a form, to where you can have your, the various inputs that the form will take, and those would be stored as its own local state within that form component, so that it then could be sent up to maybe the app or wherever it needs to be sent. So what Redux does is come in and basically takes the heavy lifting of maybe your app or several different components having multiple states, and it kind of takes it all together and moves it up into what's called the global state, and or the store is what I guess another technical term you could use for what Redux calls its state. And the purpose of that, again, is to take it away from the state, anyways, to take the state responsibility away from the components themselves and kind of house it in the Redux store, so that any component that needs access or the ability to either get information from the state or to send information to the state can connect directly to that store. And I'll go into a little bit of that, how that works here in a bit. But that's kind of the main idea of what the Redux store and what Redux is for. Again, it's essentially just a global state management system. And so I'm going to talk about how it works specifically to and with React, and the various pieces of the cycle that make up how it works and how to use it, when to use it, and why to use it, and so forth. And so the first piece of the cycle, I guess, if you want to say where it starts, of course, with a cycle, it's kind of hard to say where starting point would be, but if you wanted to pick one out, it really kind of begins with what's called the action creator. And the action creator is a function that basically you can give this action creator information just as you would with any other function. You pass it in as arguments, and the function takes parameters. You give it arguments, and then it outputs a desired result, basically. And so with this action creator, you give it information, and this information is called the payload, and then the return value of this action creator is called the action object. So it's exactly what it sounds like. It's an object, a JavaScript object that has properties, and it's the object created from the action creator. So it's very well named. It's exactly what it sounds like. You fire off this action creator function. It returns to you an action object, and then that object is kind of the key piece of how all this is going to work, and the information that kind of kickstarts this whole domino effect of either changing the state, updating the state, or accessing the state. And so with this action object, it has two main pieces of information, and these are very important. Again, the information that you give the function was payload, and that maintains with the dispatch, with the action object. And so it creates this action object, which is then dispatched to a reducer. But again, this action object is going to take, or it's going to have a type and a payload. And those are the two big pieces of this action object. And of course, the type is usually going to be one specific property. And typically you'll see this named, this property will be named in a certain way that kind of gives you an idea of what it's doing. And so, for instance, from a very basic level, think of a to-do list that you would make with a React architecture. Some things that you would think that you would probably do with a to-do app. You know, you want to make a to-do, you want to delete a to-do, maybe you want to update a to-do. So those are three kind of, actions that you would probably do if you were going to make a to-do list app. And so you could think of the type on this action object to be something to the effect of add to do, delete to do, update to do, something like that. And so effectively this type is basically just going to say, what is this action object? What's the purpose of it? The other part of that is going to be the payload. And the payload is just the information that is needed to perform that specific action. So again, thinking to a basic to-do list. So you got let's say you're going to make an action object that's going to add a to-do. Obviously you have a type, maybe add to-do, and then the payload will be maybe a title for that to-do, that certain to-do item that you want, maybe a description of what it is, whether or not it's priority, whether or not it's completed. And so that's just basically the information about that certain item that will then be used as a typical JavaScript object at that point. And so once you have this action object made from this action creator function, then it gets dispatched. So the term here, dispatch, is kind of sending it off to what's called a reducer. And the reducer it's another function, and this one is going to look, the most common way that I've seen it used is going to be with the switch case, switch function, which is a really fancy, basically if-else statement. It looks at logic, and based on, it's going to look for the action object type, and you want to set this reducer up to where it's going to look for the various types that it could be receiving, and then based on what type that it gets from the action object will determine the logic that this reducer function is going to carry out. And so the reducer function is going to, and a key part of the reducer is that you're going to have a reducer function for each of the various pieces of state that you'll have. So you'll have this, you'll have a big global state for the entire app that's housed in the Redux store. And say you'll have, again, going back to to-do list, maybe you'll have, really on this, you'll only have maybe a to-dos array that'll house it, all the various to-dos. But thinking like on a larger scale, so say you had like a website in which somebody could log into and view various things, and so maybe you want to have in your global state a user property for the state. Say if they're going to, think of something like Netflix, where you're going to have a bunch of movies or a bunch of items that can be accessed or viewed or manipulated in this app that you're making. Maybe you'll have a state property that will house all of the items of your app. You'll have a property for the user. Maybe you'll have any kind of error functions or error properties that you'll want to display on the page at some point. But basically anything that you want to store in your global state, each piece of those, each piece of the state, you're going to have a specific reducer to handle that part of the state itself. And so, and each of the reducers again are going to, the action object will be dispatched to this reducer, and this reducer is then going to look at the type of action object that it just received, and it will then perform certain logic based on the type that it received, and then again based on the information. So let's go back to the to-do list app. And so say we dispatch an action object that is an add to do with a title, a description, and maybe is completed or not. The reducer then gets that action object, it's dispatched that action object, and it sees that the type is add to do, and it'll go through its switch case functionality, and it'll see, okay, I have a case of add to do, and then you'll tell it at that point, okay, I want to maybe add this to do item into my array of to dos. And so some key pieces to this reducer here. Again, it is a function, and it holds the initial state and the initial value. The initial value for the state. So in this case, maybe your initial value is an empty array or an array of to-dos that you already have. But effectively, you'll say, all right, my to-do state is an array that either is empty because there's nothing in it, or if you have some to-dos already in there, it'll house those. And so that's the first piece of what you'll tell your reducer function is what's the original state. And then, of course, you're going to give it the action object as well. And so it will then look at the action object. It'll see what type of object that it is, and then it will do the functionality that you have told it to do. And in this case, it'll be adding a to-do list. And so it's going to look and see, okay, I have a type that says add to do. So I'm going to then, the original value of my state is this array. And then maybe I'm going to add this to-do list or this to-do item that we've given, again, to your action object, we've given it a title, we've given it a description, whether or not it's completed, and we've turned that into an object. We're going to add that object into our to-do array in our global state. And so that reducer function will carry that functionality out for you by looking at the type of its action object, basically what am I supposed to do with it, and then doing what you've told it to do. And in this case, it's adding a to-do to your to-do list item or to your to-do list array in your global state. And again, as I said moments ago, you want a reducer function for each piece of your state. And then again, within that each specific reducer, you're going to want, it'll look for the various actions that it can perform based on the type that you've given it once the dispatch is happening. And then Redux gives us a method that basically combines the reducer. It's a function called combine reducers. And that will then, so say you have a gigantic app that has 15 pieces to its global state, user, items, maybe a shopping cart, and just every piece of the app that it needs to work. And this combine reducer is going to look at all of those, and it's going to combine them, and that's what makes the store. And again, that's given to us from Redux itself. But so you have several reducer functions that each one looks for a specific case, a specific scenario, which is determined by your action object type, and then it will do the required task with the actions object's payload that you've given it. And so so we start with our action creator, which makes an action object that gets dispatched to the reducer function. The reducer function takes apart this action object, it sees it has a type, so what do I do, and then with what am I doing it? And it then will either it'll manage the state how it needs to, updating the state's value as been laid out in the logic that you've written for it. And then again, Redux gives us a method that combines the reducer, and that's what makes the actual global store, the Redux store. And so that's kind of how you can update and maybe manage the store. But how do the components actually get or send information to and from the store? So if with the standard React architecture, you have maybe your class component, which will have its own local state, and that component has direct access to its local state, obviously. And then with that, maybe if a functional component wants or needs access to the state from a class component, the class component can then send down information as props to the functional component. So with this Redux global store or state management, we're in effect kind of plucking the state away from this class component and moving it up to the Redux store. So now, since this class component and maybe this functional component don't have access to its local state anymore, how do they get that? So there's two really huge functions, methods that have been given to us again from Redux. One is called map state to props, and the other is map dispatch to props. They are very well named because they do kind of exactly what they say, what they're named. So again, React works with components and props. It's kind of the general idea of how it works, and then each component can use its props to do things or to display things onto the page. And so if you've taken the local state away from the components themselves, they still need a way to access the store. And those two methods, map state to props and match dispatch to props, are the way that happens. And again, it does exactly what it sounds like. So let's start with map state to props. So if a component needs access to your Redux store, the global state, this component is still going to use that information as props. So that doesn't change. So if you think about what the words say, map state to props. So I have a component that needs props and I have a global state. I'm going to map the state to this component as props. And so with that, you give that method some parameters as well. You give the map state to props, you give it the state. So you're giving that function the state. And then in the logic, you return an object to that component. And then you can, you're giving a state object to that component. And then you're kind of piecing out, you're breaking off of what parts of the state that you need, or what that specific component needs, so that then it can use it just as before in regular React, so that then you can do things or show things onto the page. And so typically when you're mapping the state to the props, what you're doing is passing down information from the state to the component so that it can use it to render things, basically. And that's going to be the most common use case. You'll see why you would need to map the state to the props. The other one, map dispatch to props. So we think back to the beginning of this whole thing. You have an action creator function that gives you an action object, which is then dispatched to the producers to manipulate the state as needed. So map dispatch to prop. Again, let's think about the words. The dispatch is sending off the action object to the state, or to the reducers, to then manipulate the state. So we have a component that needs props in order to do things. And so if we are mapping dispatch to the props of this component, so you have this dispatch methodology or functionality that you can use. You're mapping the ability to send the dispatch or to dispatch the action object as a prop. And so this is effectively like giving a method. So say maybe in normal React, your app has a method within itself that you want maybe a child component to also be able to have access to. So you can send that method itself down as a prop. And it's the same idea here. Dispatch is a method given to us by Redux, and we are giving this specific component the ability to use this method of dispatching the information that it needs to the reducers, which kicks off the whole cycle. So again, the two main functions that we have, map state to props and map dispatch to props. It's working very similar as before, but rather than maybe a class component holding local state that you're going to then send down props to a child component, so you're now rerouting all of that to Redux's global state, and that's the big benefit of that. And on a grand scale, why is this useful? Is because it allows you to avoid what's known as prop drilling. So say if you have an app that has state that's holding a lot of the information that the whole app is going to need, but maybe you have dozens of components. It's going to take a lot of working into like trickle down where and how a certain method or a piece of information. So it'll have to go maybe from your app to this component to that component to that component to that component, just so that it can then send it back up. Well, if you have a global state we get from Redux, rather than going from a God component and then trickling all the way down to this component, you can just go directly from your Redux store straight to that component. One-way ticket, well, two ways if you want to both send and receive. But say this component really only needs to get some information from the store, rather than it trickling down, through multiple 5 or so different components. It can go straight from the state straight to that component, and it just makes it a lot simpler, a lot cleaner, more efficient. And then of course, if bugs arise, it's a little easier to kind of figure out maybe where something was passed incorrectly or is not getting passed up correctly. So rather than having to look at 4 or 5 different components, making sure everything's passed through correctly, you're really only doing it one time straight to the Redux store. And so that's an overview of the Redux cycle. Again, just a recap very briefly. You have an action creator, which is a function that makes an action object, which has 2 main pieces, a type and a payload, and then that is dispatched to a reducer function that then takes apart that action object, sees what type it has and the information that it has, the payload, and it performs a specific action based on the type that was given, and then it does a specific action with the payload. And then each piece of the global state has its own reducer function, and there's a method that we get from Redux which combines the reducer called combine reducer, and it goes through each piece of your state and finds its reducer function, makes it into one root reducer, which then creates the global store, the global state. Then we can then use to pass down to any and all the props that need to use it for whatever reason. And that is done by the 2 methods again given to us from Redux, map state to props and match dispatch to props. So again, you're just giving components props, but rather than them getting props from a parent component, they are getting props from the Redux store so that they can either receive or send information to the Redux store to be manipulated as needed. And that is the Redux cycle for React, and it makes life a lot easier. So.